All right.
Good afternoon. We are so excited. We are so excited. We are so excited to see each and every one of you here on today. I am excited, especially because we're going to have a fantastic conversation on today. As you know, for the last month, we have been studying in honor of Black History Month the story of Emmett Till. And we have been looking at the story of Emmett Till from the perspective of trauma. As you know, we first began to examine the story of Emmett Till as trauma when we first talked about the plight he faced as a young boy, having to grow up without his father because his father was unfortunately killed as a result of racism. And it was eerily similar circumstances for the way Emmett Till's dad died versus how his mom is often perceived in the world as being a single mom. And so we talked about what are the ways in which this is trauma that our young boys now have to be raised by single moms in light of racism that exists in our world today when dads are killed or when dads are incarcerated as a result of an unfair prison industrial complex system. We also talked about the trauma of the environment where unfortunately racism, poverty, unemployment, these systemic sociological issues also cause trauma in the lives of people. And so we began to hash out and talk about the trauma in this regard as well. Also, in this conversation, we also began to talk about what is the trauma of the bystander effect when bystanders see events of violence happening and do nothing. We spent considerable amount of time talking about that. And so last but not least, we spent some time also in this conversation highlighting the unfortunate act of trauma of kidnapping when young Emmett is sleeping at his relative's home in this particular southern town, and he is awakened because an angry mob is now at his relative's door in Money, Mississippi, and he is kidnapped. And so we talked about the ways in which kidnapping is also an unfortunate act that leads to trauma in people's lives. And now we're going to spend some time now discussing and highlighting the unfortunate trauma of seeing violence. We're going to spend some time talking about the unfortunate trauma of seeing violence. You know this story all too well. You know what happened when young Emmett Till is unfortunately killed, and his body is returned to Chicago, and his mother decides to have an open casket. She decides to have an open casket so that the world will see what exactly happened to her son. This was an act of bravery on her part, we'd say. This was the act of shining light on the atrocities that her son was faced with. I am just so enamored with her sense of courage around this. She was a Black woman filled with courage of being able to show the world what happened to her, what happened to her son. This is the image as I share my screen. Oh, as I get ready to share my screen, please grab a pen and paper, please. This is the image that has gone viral around our viewing of our beloved Emmett Till. This is the image that we've seen time and time again on the cover of Essence and Jet magazines. We've seen these images, if you will, that seem to highlight his unfortunate body and the brutality of the victimization done to him. And this is a very, very interesting act of courage that our particular sister, Mamie Till, engages in showing the world her sons. And so we want to spend some time just highlighting for a second, what does it mean to see violence? What is the impact of seeing violence? We often say, in some sense, showing violence has two effects. Showing violence has two effects. Early in the 1960s, during the civil rights movement, 1950s and the 1960s, civil rights leader, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., loved to show these particular images of violence because he believed that it was so important to work with the media to show images of Bull Connor taking dogs, using dogs as weapons, taking fire hose, using water and fire hose as weapons against peaceful protesters to shock the world. Dr. Martin Luther King believed in and understood the psychology of violence and the ways in which there is a benefit to showing it on television. One of the benefits is it shocks the world. One of the benefits is it shocks the world. What do I mean by that? He understood a dynamic that in the South, he was trying to gain the sentiment of the larger world, Northern brothers and sisters in particular. And so he loved to have news stations and cameras show up during peaceful protests so that the entire world could see, wow, in the South, police officers are using billy clubs to beat innocent Black folks who are participating in peaceful, nonviolent demonstrations. And as a result, his plan worked. The psychology and the heart of many persons in the North was pricked. And they began to put pressure on many governors in many southern states like Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia around, why are you being mean to those protesters? Maybe we should think about giving equal rights to these protesters. Maybe we should think about, in some sense, listening to them, listening to their cries for justice. And so, picking up on this wonderful, courageous mentality of using media to show acts of violence, years later, our Black Lives Matter movement would use social media in the same way that Martin Luther King used television media and newspapers and magazines to show the atrocities of civil rights. The Black Lives Matter movement, started by three African-American millennial young ladies, to be specific, is known for the ways in which they highlight using social media today. You have saw several times, I bet, the video of Eric Gardner taking his final moments as he is in a chokehold in New York by a New York police officer. And now he's screaming, "I can't breathe." You saw most recently in 2020 the video of George Floyd begging for his life because an officer is kneeing him in the neck underneath a vehicle. You see these incidents as they have went viral. And central to the Black Lives Matter movement is the wonderful ways in which social media has shown violence towards Black people and pricked the heart of our nation, even now, all over the world. As we know, the video of George Floyd went viral all over the world. There were people protesting this injustice, not just here in the United States. And so by having an open casket in 1955 of her son's brutally abused body, beautiful, terribly lynched body, in some sense, this becomes the spearhead of the civil rights movement. It is believed that seeing this open casket funeral and seeing this open casket of Emmett Till's badly beaten body on display is what pricked the heart of Martin Luther King spearhead the civil rights movement and say yes when a group of civil rights leaders asked him to take the lead in leading this movement. It is believed, what inspired Rosa Parks to remain in her seat on a particular bus in Montgomery at the time, to protest injustice. So I believe she had also been a witness to pictures of Emmett Till's body and its open casket funeral. And this also pricked her heart. We must, however, talk about now what is the second impact of watching violence. It would be nice to just lift up the positives, right? The positives are it gets the word out that an injustice has occurred. But we also say there are some negatives. There are some negatives. Before I jump into the negatives, I want you to check out a particular Bible story. It is believed that Mamie Till thought of this idea of keeping his body, her beloved son Emmett Till's body, on display as an act of courage, but also because she felt inspired by a particular Bible story. Please, I hope you have pen and paper to write this Bible story down. I hope you were able to grab pen and paper. If you were to examine a biblical story of a woman named Rizpah, Rizpah. Again, that's Rizpah, Rizpah, Rizpah. Rizpah in 2 Samuel 21 does something similar. 2 Samuel 21. Have you heard that story before? I hope you would please check out that story. Rizpah's sons are killed through state-sanctioned violence by King David at the time. And Rizpah is so sad as mother of the particular sons that happen to be killed. Rizpah is so sad that she refuses to have her sons buried. Read all about this, 2 Samuel 21. It is believed, as the story goes, she is so sad about this unfortunate killing of her sons, that is state-sanctioned violence by King David, that she refuses to have their bodies buried after they are killed. Some believe for about 3 to 6 months. She keeps her sons' bodies out. They were hung on a cross. She refuses to take their bodies down. She keeps their bodies on this cross for the whole city and town to see as an act of courage to show this is what David allowed. As legend would have it, it is believed that the town was in a major drought and experiencing famine. And also, it is believed that David sought the Lord, asked the Lord, what should I do to cease this famine? And it is thought or believed that he needed to fix a particular war, a fight, an ingrown fight that occurred with his predecessors, King Saul, and another warring country. And he believed that it was his desire or it was his calling to give over the descendants, the remaining descendants of Saul's household, to this army that Saul had, to this particular country that Saul had did wrong by, as the story would go. And so David agrees, and it just so happens that Rizpah and two of her sons were descendants of Saul. And so David gives over about 7 young men who were believed to be Saul's descendants in total, 2 of them being Rizpah's sons. David gives permission for this warring country to now have the lives of these remaining sons or descendants of Saul. And so he believed that that's what was needed to now stop the famine and the drought in the land. That's the atonement or the sacrificial lamb that needed to be sacrificed on behalf of the country. And Rizpah is sad about that. This is the first biblical act of state-sanctioned violence to an unarmed Black boys, if you will. And so she refuses, just like Mamie Till refused to have a closed casket. Rizpah refuses to have a closed casket until David apologizes. Until David apologizes to Rizpah for his actions. Then Rizpah says, okay, I'll agree to have them removed from the cross in which they were lynched and given a proper burial, government burial, if you will. So read more about that story in 2 Samuel 21. So we celebrate women and sisters like Rizpah. We celebrate sisters like Mamie Till. We celebrate sisters like our 3 founders of our current Black Lives Matter movement for their courage in displaying violence to grab attention. But what becomes problematic is we don't talk about the trauma that comes from watching violence. We don't talk about what is the trauma of actually watching violence. There is trauma in that. There's much trauma in that. So now, let us turn to the period of lynchings in our country. Lynchings were an act of visual trauma. Yes. What do I mean by that? Oftentimes, the act of watching a Black body being lynched would cause psychological trauma to persons, particularly the victim's family and friends. There is a video that I want to invite us to watch at this time. I promise this video is okay for us to see. It's about 5 minutes. It's about 5 minutes long. I'm going to share this video all about lynching, highlighted from the Equal Justice Initiative, EJI. Hold on, please grab pen and paper so you can take notes as I share my screen and we check out this video. Can everyone see my screen? Pastor, can you see the screen?
Oh, yes, yes.
All right, let's check out this video.
After slavery was prohibited in 1865, formerly enslaved people in America were granted full citizenship, the right to vote, and under the 14th Amendment, protection from racial violence. After slavery was prohibited in 1865, formerly enslaved people in America were granted full citizenship, the right to vote, and under the 14th Amendment, protection from racial violence. Formerly enslaved people were promised land and opportunity, but most got nothing because America quickly devolved into an era of racial terrorism and oppression for black citizens. White people in the South were angry that people formerly considered property were now equal citizens. Many turned to violence. In the years immediately following the Civil War, thousands of black people were murdered when they tried to claim their rights. Soon afterwards, federal troops were withdrawn from the South, ending a brief period of racial progress known as Reconstruction. Nationwide resistance to racial equality resulted in the reestablishment of racial subordination through biased laws, disenfranchisement, and terrorism, most dramatically enforced through lynchings. Racial terror lynchings of black people defined a shameful era in America. These lynchings differed from the hanging of white people in places where there was no functioning criminal justice system. Racial terror lynchings were directed at all black people. They enforced compliance with racial hierarchy and white supremacy, and ensured racial segregation and denial of equal rights. In 1916, in Cedar Bluff, Mississippi, a young black man named Jeff Brown accidentally bumped into a white woman while running to catch a train. A white mob stopped him and lynched him, beating him and then hanging him from a tree for his insolence and carelessness. His public murder was not about criminal punishment, but was instead about maintaining racial hierarchy and terrorizing the black community. White town residents proudly sold photographs of Mr. Brown's brutalized body hanging from the tree for 5 cents each. The Equal Justice Initiative has documented thousands of racial terror lynchings between 1877 and 1950. EJI has confirmed the lynchings of over 4,000 black people who were tortured, maimed, beaten, shot, hung, and burned alive by crowds of white people, often with the cooperation of law enforcement or government officials. The terror of lynching was so widespread that millions of black people fled the South and settled in the urban North and West as refugees of American terror, shaping the current demographic geography of the United States. On July 5, 1933, an older black woman named Elizabeth Lawrence reprimanded a group of white children who threw rocks at her as she walked home from work. Word spread that a black woman had dared to rebuke white children, and that night, an angry mob of white citizens lynched Ms. Lawrence for her audacity. Her home was then burned to the ground. Her son, Alexander, fled to Boston. Racial terror lynchings often had the atmosphere of carnivals, with food vendors and souvenir stands. Hundreds or thousands of white people would often gather to watch and take part in the torture and murder of black citizens. There has been no effort in America to confront this legacy of racial terror. While hundreds of Confederate monuments litter the landscape in southern states, there has been no public recognition of the violence endured by black people. On October 7, 1910, a white mob in Montgomery, Alabama tried to abduct and lynch black men being held in jail on suspicion of miscegenation, or interracial sexual relations. When they were unable to get the men out of the jail, the frustrated mob lynched a black taxi driver named John Dell, who was sitting in his cab nearby. No one was ever arrested or prosecuted for his murder. EJI's Community Remembrance Project collects soil from the many sites where terror lynchings occurred. Jars labeled with the names of murdered black citizens are on public display at EJI, a powerful visual reminder of history we must face. EJI is working to create a permanent memorial to honor victims of lynching, a place to reflect on America's history of racial violence. We hope to place historical markers at hundreds of lynching sites around the country. Contemporary issues like police violence, excessive punishment in the criminal justice system, and even harsh and punitive treatment of children of color in schools and on streets cannot be understood without a deeper examination into our history of racial violence. More truthful discourse and reflection on our history of racial injustice is essential for us to achieve racial equity. Confronting the legacy of lynching is critical to advancing this conversation. We hope you will join our effort to help towns, cities, and states confront and recover from these tragic histories of racial violence through truth and reconciliation, where there can truly be equal justice for all.
We also have a particular group of slides I'd like to show, highlighting the work of the Equal Justice Initiative. If you haven't had an opportunity to visit, I would invite everybody to please, 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 please visit the Equal Justice Initiative. I'm telling you, you won't be disappointed. We want to invite you to check out the wonderful work that our Equal Justice Initiative takes in highlighting these unfortunate acts of trauma in our community, from African enslavement to not mass incarceration. So I just want to take a moment to present some slides or information to you. We say, in some sense, lynchings have now transcended even to the way we think of mass incarceration. It's all interconnected. The Equal Justice Initiative was founded by a wonderful brother by the name of Brian Stevenson. You will remember him for being a widely acclaimed public interest lawyer and best-selling author of Just Mercy. EJI, the Equal Justice Initiative, is a private 501c3 nonprofit organization that works with communities to have marginalized persons who are incarcerated free, especially if they are wrongfully convicted. EJI is actively engaged in campaigns that draw a correlation between lynchings of Black bodies and how it relates now to our criminal justice system. And so there's two wonderful pieces of artwork that we want to invite you to check out. You can check out the Legacy Museum, and you can also check out the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. The Legacy Museum first opened to the public on April 26, 2018 in Montgomery, Alabama. And it's a 11,000 square foot museum built on the site of a former warehouse where enslaved Black people were imprisoned. And it's located midway between an historic slave market and the main river dock and train station, where tens of thousands of enslaved people were trafficked during the height of African enslavement. By 1860, it's believed that Montgomery was the capital of the domestic slave trade in Alabama. There is the formal address and what the outside of the Legacy Museum looks like. Please jot this address down: 115 Coosa Street, Coosa, Montgomery, Alabama, 36104. And what's so cool about this museum is these state-of-the-art artwork that you see. So first, the museum is divided into sections, 4 sections to be exact. The first section highlights kidnapping. And that's the name of the first exhibit or section, Kidnapped. where it highlights the kidnapping of African bodies from Africa, starting in or beginning in 1619, when the first slave ships arrived to Jamestown, Virginia in 1619. That's the first section. And so the museum highlights what was it like for enslaved bodies to be enslaved and first have to make this pilgrimage or trek under duress across the Atlantic Ocean. What was it like having to actually be enslaved when they finally arrived here? What was it like to be ripped for not performing duties and responsibilities according to the demands or expectations of European racist slave masters? And so this museum is a wonderful interactive museum that allows you to participate in watching these videos, if you will, that you see here on your screen, so that you are transported into the world of persons who are enslaved, so that you can fully experience through your five senses what it was actually like to be enslaved. There's also this wonderful piece of artwork entitled Doubt by Titus Caffer. You will see compelling visuals that talk about the racial trauma or racial terrorism that our people had to undergo during the time period of African enslavement. And you will also see important artwork that highlights Journey to Freedom. What was it like for persons such as Harriet Tubman to rescue slaves, enslaved persons, and bring them to the North? This image is of an image of Harriet Tubman as she is taking a child and attempting to get to freedom. The next section is known as the Jim Crow section in this museum that talks about lynchings. And the name of this section is called Terrorized. It is believed that during the period of Jim Crow in this country from 1865 to the 1950s, 9 million people, it is believed that 9 million Black bodies were lynched. 9 million. Can you believe it? 9 million Black bodies were lynched. And so the irony is, when we talk about Emmett Till's lynching in 1955, this was not the first lynching. This was the lynching that kicked off or spearheaded the civil rights movement. However, what some say is this lynching was most notarized and received the most attention because it was done to a child. But it is believed that by the time, unfortunately, that Emmett Till was lynched, 9 million people had already been lynched before Emmett Till's untimely murder. And so this museum then highlights and wants you, again, tapping into the five senses to experience what was it like in particular in communities and neighborhoods where lynchings occurred. And so these are jars, as our video highlighted. These are jars of the grounds that was actually picked up and taken, the pavement and the ground where lynchings occurred. They were actually taken and saved after all of these years as a commemoration to the particular victims who were lynched. And so if you visit this museum, you can actually feel much of the materials in each one of these jars that were supposed to be the pavement or the grassy area or the dirt area. And each of these jars has the actual name of the person who was lynched right there at that scene. After we talk about being terrorized, now we move into the civil rights era, where segregation was at an all-time high. After Emmett Till is unfortunately lynched, and as I shared earlier, the heart and mind of Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders are pricked. They will now begin to enter into trying to protest, in particular legislation, and protest the ways in which segregation in all areas and walks of life, as well as segregation in schools, segregation in politics, is deplorable. And so the museum also takes us to, again, touching your five senses. What was it like to live in the 1960s during the time period of segregation, where you would be inundated in daily life with signage that said, this is for whites only, or this is a bathroom where only white people can use this bathroom, or this is a water fountain where only white people can use this water fountain. I remember growing up, my mom told me about a time when she went to the movie theater as a young girl with my grandmother. She was about 9 years old. And there were open seats on the main floor of the movie theater. But Black people had to enter the movie theater through a back door and climb up all 2 or 3 flights of stairs to go to a balcony to watch a movie, to watch a movie. My mother recalls the sadness that she, as a young girl, had to face in living this way, if you will. She was born, my mother was born in 1956. And she talks about how at 9 years old, in 1965, when she would try to go to the movie theater or use a particular toilet or restroom or water fountain, she would be inundated with these type of signs during the period of segregation. Here's another image of these signs. And so when we talk about looking at lynched bodies, we also have to begin to wrestle with what is the trauma of looking at a lynched body? What is the trauma of looking at a lynched body? The Equal Justice Initiative now says, now, after living through kidnappings, after living through being terrorized, after living through being segregated, we must now recognize that lynchings show up today through our mass incarceration policies. And so Brian Stevenson has done wonderful work around highlighting how the way we lynch Black men, Black boys, Black girls, Black women today is by now incarcerating them. And so in the museum, there's this interactive piece where you can actually talk to someone who is incarcerated. Again, a desire to engage your five senses and hear the stories of Black men in particular who are incarcerated through this interactive display where you would actually pick up that telephone and actually have a conversation with these brothers and listen to their stories. And so if you haven't had an opportunity to visit this museum, I would invite you to visit this museum. It is a wonderful, wonderful visual. Before we get into our next pieces, we're going to talk about what specifically causes us trauma when we watch the body being lynched. What exactly happens to us physically? But before we get into that, I want to pause for any questions or thoughts from our pastor or our audience.
Okay, we don't have any any comments yet. I do want to mention that, yeah, I've been to the Legacy Museum and the memorial, and it is incredible. It is incredible in Montgomery. And I also want to mention that this past Saturday, I saw a rare treat. Wynton Marsalis and the Lincoln Center Jazz Band were downtown Chicago at the Symphony Center, and the whole program was centered around justice. And Brian Stevenson narrated each piece, and it was all linked to, justice. But here is the special treat. Brian Stevenson played the piano on 2 numbers with Wynton Marsalis and the Lincoln Center Jazz Group. Brian Stevenson can play the piano, man.
I didn't know that. Oh, wow.
I didn't
that.
either.
Wow.
I didn't either when he sat down and he got
idea.
down. Yeah.
Wow. Wow. That's so interesting. Wow. And so when we talk about lynchings, it's important for us to begin to highlight the ways in which lynchings, watching a body being lynched, causes what we call racial trauma or PTSD in the DMS-5. What do we mean by that? All right. I don't want to sound gory, but it's so important to have these conversations. It's so important to have these conversations and talk about this. And it's so important for us to know. It's so important for us to know our history. So, pivotal to a lynching is European slave masters would actually force an entire family to come and watch the lynching, to view their loved one being lynched. This was to instill fear. This was to instill a warning to the surviving members that if you engage in doing whatever this person did, you will meet the same fate, whatever that was. Number two, we often discover in some sense that lynchings also were horrific and horrendous in that they turned into a party where white persons would bring their entire families out to the scene of a lynching with food. And they would actually have a barbecue or a picnic. Hence, the term picnic is actually derived from 3 words, and I won't repeat them, but you can figure them out. 3 words highlighting pick a, and then the N word. And so this act of us having picnics today where we bring food and we sit in a park and we eat, that's actually derived from lynchings. And so some people today refuse to even use the word picnic to describe going out with friends, sitting in a park and eating dinner, because it has racist connotations back to when lynchings occur. And so while we also celebrate people like Mamie Till and our Black Lives Matter movement and our biblical character Rispa for the ways in which they wanted to show the world the body of their deceased loved one, we also have to account for the ways in which that is actually a traumatic event to see, where the viewer will actually experience racial trauma or PTSD. What do I mean by that? Looking at this image on your screen, first thing we will notice is a negative, unprecedented, uncontrollable violation or assault will take place. In other words, the racist event will occur. As a result of the racist event occurring, next, there will be a traumatic reaction. There'll be a traumatic reaction that'll also occur. There'll be a traumatic reaction that will also occur. In addition to that traumatic reaction, something else will happen. But in that traumatic reaction, it is so important to highlight these feelings that will arise in the midst of that traumatic reaction, such as shock, disbelief, fear, shame, humiliation, and confusion. This traumatic reaction is also as a result of cumulative small prior assaults. This is so important to highlight. Oftentimes we say, when persons explode, it is because they have had to endure a long-standing cumulative set of small prior assaults. And they just get tired, and then they explode and they get angry. That is trauma. These constantly small cumulative assaults prick at us, continue to prick at us. Like if you were to take a safety pin and continue to push this safety pin towards your skin and prick your skin. If this happens over and over and over again, you will experience a traumatic event where you will explode. And so this traumatic reaction will now lead to symptom clusters. Symptom clusters. Symptom clusters are defined as barriers to treatment or barriers to help. So that when you experience a racist event that leads to a traumatic reaction, when nobody addresses the violation, you will now have symptom clusters of trauma. Symptom clusters occurred through rioting, for example, when it was deemed that George Floyd was going to be killed and there would be no accountability. This is what caused riots, a symptom cluster around a larger system that will not hold a racist police officer or other racist police officers accountable. And so these symptom clusters are now experiencing intrusion or avoidance or negative mood cognitions or physiological arousal. We say these are 4 types of symptom clusters that people experience now when they experience a racist event and a traumatic reaction, and the perpetrator of the violence is not held accountable. They will now begin to experience these 4 types of symptom clusters. Any combination of these, or 1 or 2 of them, or even all 4 of them. And so there is now wonderful research showing that racial trauma now leads to high rates of PTSD, anxiety, and other forms of depression through these 4 dynamics you see at the bottom of your screen. The person who is credited with looking at this is a psychologist by the name of Monica Williams, Monennica, Monica Williams, Monennica. What's the good news? What's the good news for us today? We don't want to end on a bad note. We don't want to end on sadness. We want to end on good news. So for us, the good news is there's wonderful strategies that we can employ for coping with racial trauma. I'll make these larger so we can see these for a moment. First, we say coping with racial trauma encourages us first to protect and process. Protect and process. Now, I'm sure you're wondering, protect and process what? We say protect our emotional spirit, our emotional state, and our spiritual state, and process those feelings. Protect our mind, our body, and our spirit. our emotional state, our spiritual state, and our physical state. Protection, protection, protection becomes key. And also process those feelings. So, what does it look like to avoid triggers or set boundaries? Talk to like-minded friends and family members and know when to seek support. Recognize symptoms of anxiety or anger that are coming up within us. Practice self-care, exercise, deep breathing techniques, body scanning. Practice cognitive skills like prayer, meditation. And don't be afraid to protest. Organize protests in our communities where we know lynchings are taking place. Another active service that we can engage in is looking for opportunities to speak and act. Use our position of privilege to address injustice and intolerance. Amplify voices that may be marginalized before speaking for them. Having conversations about racial trauma and racism. Don't shy away or feel that it's taboo. Keep yourself informed. Reflect on your privilege with an eye towards growth, not guilt. Take the time to learn about different races and ethnicities. Watch films, listen to new music, try new foods. Learn about different groups of people. And lastly, engage in activism of some sort. Engage in activism of some sort. You can engage in activism by supporting anti-racist organizations, supporting business owned by people of color, support Black businesses, encourage critical race theory, cite and read materials by persons of color. POC stands for persons of color. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you very much, family. Thank you, thank you, thank you. You know, March 1st is officially Women's History Month. March 1st is officially Women's History Month. And there is, in light of March 1st, today kicking off officially Women's History Month, there is a particular book that we want to invite you to check out. There's a particular book that we want to invite you to check out. And starting next week, family, starting next week, we are going to be reading, this book. So I'm gonna invite you to grab this book, When Mama Speaks. We're gonna be focused on this book. In light of this being Women's History Month, we're gonna be reading When Mama Speaks. So please grab this book. You can grab it online from Amazon or your favorite bookstore if you don't support Jeff Bezos. Feel free, grab this book, When Mama Speaks, the Bible and Motherhood from a womanist perspective by Dr. Stephanie Buchanan Crowder. For our Women's History Month, this is the book that we're going to highlight. And so in this book, Dr. Stephanie Buchanan Crowder highlights important mothers in the Bible. So we're going to jump back into the Bible, spend our time together and highlight particular women of faith, in particular mothers. Thank you very much, family. If you want any of the slides that we discussed during our time together, feel free to text me, 773-499-2631. 773-499-2631. If you want me to put a slide back up for us to look at it again in these last few moments, then just holler out and I'll place it back up on the screen.
Awesome. Yeah, you know, I wanted to mention on the that lynching piece, that it has been has been commented on that the postcard industry did not have a market until they started taking pictures and sending them across the nation of Black bodies butchered and brutalized on trees. And the postcard industry took off. And
Wow.
so that's how the postcard industry became popular, through sending those little pictures of Black bodies. So looking forward to next week. And Stephanie Crowder's book. Everybody, hopefully you get a chance to get it. And we'll check you out next week. Let's see. Ruthie Fordham says, what were the last two numbers to contact you, please?
773-499-2631. If you text me, I'll send you those images. 773-499-2631.
All right. All right. Okay.
Thank you.
We look forward to seeing you next week.
All righty, see you
All
later.
right.